People often say, young people especially, I want to do something for the world. I want to be of service during my lifetime. It's long been my opinion that the best thing you can do for the world is to do the best thing you can do for you. Make out your want list. It's by getting what you most want that you will usually make your greatest contribution to society. We do that which we are motivated to do. The greater the motivation, the more we do. We're motivated most not by what we think we should be doing for the world, but rather by what we most want from the world. You know, Edison didn't invent the electric light for the good of humanity. He invented it because he wanted to more than anything else. That it's been a great boon to man and created one of the world's greatest industries are besides the point. The best preachers are those who enjoy being preachers, and it's the same with teachers, generals, businessmen, and wives and mothers. Those who make the greatest contribution and by so doing reap the greatest rewards are those who thoroughly enjoy what they're doing. The sourest, most miserable and unhappy people on earth are those in fields of service in which they find no deep and abiding joy. They've been punishing themselves for some imagined sin, and they look the part. They often do more harm than good. How many times have you wanted to say to someone, look, friend, if you don't like your work, why don't you quit? But don't take it out on me. So if you have your heart set on doing good for the world and or humanity, get into work for which you're best fitted, work you can thoroughly enjoy and throw yourself into 100%. A happy plumber makes a greater contribution to the world than a miserable university professor or an unhappy lawyer. Some of the world's greatest artists, people who have made tremendous contributions, were neurotic, unhappy people such as Edgar Allan Poe, Vincent van Gogh, Nietzsche, Wagner, and many others. But they had found their outlets. They had found the fields in which they wanted to work, had to work. Surely they would have been even more miserable had they not found their life's work. They would have been insufferable in any other. For some people, there's only one thing for them to do. I can't imagine a Picasso doing anything but drawing and painting pictures. But for most of the rest of us, there are undoubtedly many fields in which we can find deep satisfaction and reward. A fine business executive can be happy in any number of kinds of businesses, and in many different positions. Another man might be just as happy as a carpenter as he would be as an electrician. But when it comes to serving mankind or feeling guilty because you don't think you're doing enough, it's good to remember that we can usually serve the world best by working toward and achieving the goals we want most to reach. Millions of young people in high schools and colleges throughout the world ask themselves, how can I spend my life doing the most good? The best way is to spend your life doing that which you most want to do. In that way, everybody wins. Some time back, I made a talk to about 1,000 university students on the campus of a large, well-known American university. They were wonderfully behaved, laughed in all the right places, and were very receptive to what I had to say, for which I was indeed grateful. I noticed hundreds of them even taking notes. I was worried about that speech. I'd heard so much about the generation gap and reports from young people that anyone over 30 had nothing to say to them that I approached that speech with the trepidation of a man approaching a man-eating tiger with a willow wand. But as I say, it went off fine, and I was very much relieved. And I'm sure one of the things that averted disaster was a comment I used of Scott Buchanan. Scott Buchanan was a great educator who died in 1968. But he'd said, the powers of the mind are the powers of the man. And building the power of the mind is largely an after-school job. It's a spare-time job. This is why developing the powers of the mind are not necessarily dependent on a formal education. A good liberal education is the best start if you're lucky enough to get one. A good base of English, world history, world literature, and math are fundamental to developing the real powers of the mind, the very subject so many young people dread and work so hard to avoid. If you're interested in this subject, and you'd like to know more about Scott Buchanan and his ideas on education, there's a paperback published by the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara, California, entitled Embers of the World. It's a series of conversations with Scott Buchanan after it became apparent that he did not have much longer to live. It's a published series of conversations between Scott Buchanan and Harris Wofford Jr., Stringfellow Barr, and others. The powers of the mind are the powers of the man. Once in a talk Buchanan delivered at St. John's College, he asked, how are you doing? Do you believe in and trust your intellect, that innate power that never sleeps? You've lived a lot. You've fallen into the hands of scholars and into the grooves of practice. You've suffered the winds of doctrine and have gotten lost in the jungle of ideologies. Latterly, you've been stormed by scientific miracle. In all these learnings and practices, have you listened to the small, spontaneous voice within that asks continually if these things are true? Have you allowed this voice to speak louder and remind you that you do not know, that you do not know, that you know what you do not know? Do you believe that knowledge is possible, that truth is attainable, and that it's always your business to seek it, although evidence is overwhelmingly against it? Have you in the course of your life become your own teacher? Have you yet recognized that you are and always have been your own teacher? Liberal education has as its end the free mind, and the free mind must be its own teacher. Intellectual freedom begins when one says with Socrates that he knows nothing, and then goes on to add, I know what it is that I don't know. The powers of the mind are the powers of the man. Recent studies seem to indicate that the powers of the mind are infinite, rich, fertile land awaiting development. If you can think of something you want that is within the realm of human accomplishment, I can tell you how to get it. To do so, let me tell you a short story about what happened to a friend of mine. My friend is a multimillionaire, tears around the world in his private jet, and in general is keeping busy and having himself a pretty good time. Some years back, he was flat broke and a total failure. He was a failure as a husband, a father, a provider, and had the personality of a polecat. No friends, a complete and thoroughgoing bust. And one day he fell to wondering how people succeed in the world. Well, he had enough nerve to make an appointment with one of his city's most successful men, and during the interview asked him, how can I succeed? So the great man asked him what he wanted, and he rattled off a pretty good list of things he wanted, including a nice home, a lot more money than he was making, and so on. Well, many of them were the wrong things, you might say, but at that time of his life he still wasn't very smart. So the great and successful man gave him the secret key to all the abundance he could possibly want. And it was in this short sentence. He said, people have everything we want. People have everything we want. If all the people in this country gave you a nickel, you'd have $10 million. The people have everything you want. Your part of the bargain is to provide something for the people that they will buy in sufficient numbers to permit you to have what you want. Your part of the bargain is to be worthy of the price you set as your goal. Your job is to grow as a person to fill the shoes of the person you've decided to become. When you set a goal for yourself, you've established a self-fulfilling prophecy. A self-fulfilling prophecy, as S.I. Hayakawa has pointed out, is a statement that is neither true nor false, but is capable of becoming true if it is believed. Reaching your material goals will not mean that you're a nice guy, or that your wife and kids will like you, or that you'll be popular or intelligent or interesting. But you'll have that house and that money and anything else you want that money can buy. And if you're really smart, you'll develop at the same time the things that money cannot buy, things like humility, love of your fellow man, and that includes the wife and kids and the neighbors and so on. But as I said in the beginning, if you can think of something you want that is within the realm of human accomplishment, I can tell you how to get it. First, decide definitely upon what it is you want. With that fixed in your mind, you must then come up with the plan for providing something from within yourself, your mind and body, that will be valuable enough to people so that they'll give you what you want in return for it. They'll pay you any price. But the requirement remains the same. Your part of the bargain is to fulfill the other part. It's not particularly easy, nor is it particularly difficult. It simply must be done. How are you doing in the idea department? Do you have an idea file, a place to keep your ideas? When's the last time you wrote down a good idea? It doesn't have to be a new idea, you know. Just a little better. Back in the 15th century, there lived a great scholar of the Italian Renaissance. His name was Count Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and he was brilliant in virtually all fields: logic, ethics, theology, mathematics, Kabbalistic lore, physics. He'd studied Hebrew and Arabic. Like many of the noblemen of his day, he died from poison. It was handed to him by his secretary. There has to be a moral there someplace. But it was about something he wrote that I mention him. He wrote in an essay called The Dignity of Man that a man can choose to be anything. He can partake in, become a part of, anything he wants to. He can become a beast. He can become a god. He can do anything. Now here's writing from the Renaissance, from the 15th century, that could have been written by Sartre, Camus, or yesterday by a modern existentialist. This thought keeps reappearing throughout all of the writings of man. It's a perennial philosophy that runs through most religious thought as well. It states that we become what we choose to become, whether we realize it or not. My son used to love to watch a television program in which contestants would win a prize and then be given the choice of keeping the prize they had won or taking a chance by trading it for a prize that was hidden behind a curtain. The prize behind the curtain might be many times as valuable as the one they had, but then again it might be worthless. Man can choose to be anything, as Pico della Mirandola wrote so long ago, and as the modern existentialists point out, but man all too often doesn't know what he wants to be, or fearful that the prize behind the curtain might turn out to be a 50-pound bag of garden fertilizer, he holds on to what he has rather than risk losing it for something of less value to him. Often fearful and not aware of his real powers, living far below his true capacities, he plays for small stakes, not realizing that he holds all the cards. Or, as Huxley once put it, it's like that chess game in which our opponent is perfectly fair and would rather we win, but does insist upon our learning at least the rules of the game. For if we make mistakes, we are checkmated, without haste, but without remorse. When you come to understand something like this, it makes you sit down thoughtfully and ask yourself, what is it I want to become? Or what is it that I want to become next? We can always change course down the road. We're never irrevocably committed. It adds a zest to living, a bit of excitement to getting up in the morning when you know you can pretty well do whatever you want to do. It's sobering, too, when we reflect that if we've been adults for any appreciable length of time, we've made our lives what they are today. And if we're dissatisfied with them, at least it's probably our fault, unless we've been victims of situations over which we could exercise no control. But it's something to think about. A man can choose to be anything, or a woman. He can partake in, become a part of anything he wants to. He can become a beast. He can become a god. He can do anything. Written in the 15th century. There's a famous Italian restaurant in Evanston, Illinois, called Fanny's. It's famous because of its amazing owner, Fanny Lazar, who, in addition to overseeing one of the finest eating places in the country and makes great spaghetti, writes a newspaper column. In one of these columns, she gave some recipes for perpetual youth. Be sure to share this with your wife. She writes, history does not record how many men have searched for the fountain of youth, but centuries before Ponce de Leon there lived in ancient Alexandria a man named Theon, a noted astronomer and mathematician, who with study and research discovered the recipe for perpetual youth. Here it is. A good appetite and a good night's sleep, said Theon, for which nature demands the payment of vigorous physical and deep-breathing exercises, plus bathing in icy cold water every day of one's life. Theon raised his beautiful daughter, Hypatia, with this recipe, and she excelled every woman in Alexandria for sheer physical beauty of body and mind. She was the foremost thinker of her time, a famous Greek philosopher, one of the few female philosophers of all time. She lived from about 370 to 415. Two other great women who learned of Theon's recipe for perpetual youth were Ninon d'Anclos and Catherine, Queen of Russia. They kept their youth until advanced age. Each of them had youthful boyfriends up to and past the age of 80. They indulged in vigorous daily exercise, horseback riding and walking long distances every day of their long lives, and by bathing in icy cold water. How else could they have survived the cold and drafty palaces they lived in? Lina Cavallari, who in her youth was considered the most beautiful woman in the world, believed in daily physical exercise and deep breathing. Every morning she drank 1 tablespoon of pure olive oil to keep her skin from becoming wrinkled. She drank 1 or 2 small glasses of wine with each meal. Then there was Professor Olga B. Lepenshinskaya, who recently died at the age of 92, a biologist who was the Soviet Union's outstanding authority on how to live longer while keeping perpetual youth to old age. She participated in sports, took plenty of long walks, very hot soda baths, 1 cup of soda to a tub, once a week, and drank 1 or 2 vodkas every day. Swedish Sigrid Sampson of Chicago, 77 years young, sparkling-eyed, mentally alert. She looks young because she is young, full of enthusiasm, vim, vigor, and vitality. No stiff joints. She bends, twists, stretches 15 minutes, morning and night. Henry Blackman Sell, prominent in New York society, is an incredible octogenarian who does his own variation of yoga exercises and skips rope every day. He walks 40 blocks to his office daily, and for 25 years his pedometer has registered 40 miles a week. Mrs. Lillian R. Spencer, also of New York City, another octogenarian, is a remarkable youthful elder who attributes her health and vigor to a wholesome diet and sound sleep. Again, she exercises daily, bending and touching the floor 30 times, 3 times a day. She also takes walks and works regular hours in a department store every day. So if you want a good appetite, sound sleep, and beauty for the rest of your life, get plenty of exercise. Get out and walk if you can every day. Keep active. And as for beauty, it seems an ice-cold bath every day does it. That was old Theon's recipe. I'm a hot shower man myself. In his excellent book, Letters for Philip, Dr. Charlie Shedd writes, Dear Phil, there are 3 things I aim to do every day as a husband. 1, tell her I love her. 2, do something nice for her. And 3, pay her a compliment. The truth is that this only sounds simple, but you try these as a regular discipline and you'll see that they say easier than they do, and the toughest of those to remember may be number 3, pay her a compliment. Psychologists tell us that there are several reasons why we restrain ourselves at this point. In some cases, they say the hesitancy comes from a basic hostility syndrome, which means that we're mad at the whole world. People are no darn good, so down with everybody. Or somehow we got the message that since we ought to affect a little embarrassment when we receive compliments, why should we embarrass others by praising them? But I think there may be a more basic reason why many of us husbands are stingy with kind words, and this is because we're people, and the average specimen of the human species is naturally inclined to be selfish. We spend most of our time thinking about number 1. We're too preoccupied with our own emotional feelings. We don't have the time, take the time, or make the time to consider what it would mean to the other person if we opened our faces to say a good word. You can believe me, every woman worth the name is an addict for masculine approval, and the best way to let her know you approve of her is to tell her. There are all kinds of other ways to get the job done, but from the feminine point of view, voicing your likes is one of the nicest. You see, she has many needs, but one of her greatest is to please you. If things are normal at your house, chances are good that she's thinking of you more than you're thinking of her. This is why, if you give her some pleasant things to think about, you're doing a good thing for you and for your future together. The Bible says, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Well, this also goes for a woman. If you give her a lovely idea of herself, that's what she'll try to become. This is why it makes so much difference what you're telling her. The time finally arrives when she accepts your estimate of her as an estimate of herself. I've seen many an ordinary-looking woman grow into a lovely thing because her husband told her she was lovely. I regret to report that I've also seen some truly gorgeous women gradually fade away because they were no longer inspired from the one source that mattered most to them. All of which leads up to 6 very important words. If you like it, say so. Find something about her to compliment every day. Her voice, her face, her figure, her legs, the slope of her shoulders, the way she walks, her cooking, and the best compliment of all is to tell her, you just go on getting better all the time. A wife will come across town, across the house, across to your point of view, and across almost anything, to give you her love if you offer her yours with some honest approval. If you know some young man who's planning to get married, or someone who's already married but hasn't mastered the art, get him the book Letters to Philip by Dr. Charlie Shedd. It's published by Doubleday. The distinguished Harvard professor, author, and researcher into achievement motivation, Dr. David C. McClellan, has posed the question, what accounts for the rise in civilization? Not external resources, that is, markets, minerals, trade routes, or factories, but the entrepreneurial spirit which exploits those resources, a spirit found most often among businessmen. Who is ultimately responsible for the pace of economic growth in poor countries today? Not the economic planners or the politicians, but the executives whose drive or lack of it will determine whether the goals of the planners are fulfilled. Incidentally, if you don't have it, you should get David McClellan's book, The Achieving Society. He says, since I'm an egghead from way back, nothing surprises me more than finding myself rescuing the businessman from the academic trash heap, dusting him off, and trying to give him the intellectual respectability that he's had a hard time maintaining for the last 50 years or so. For the fact is that the businessman has taken a beating, not just from the Marxists, who pictured him as a greedy capitalist, and the social critics who held him responsible for the Great Depression of the 30s, but even from himself, deep in his heart. One of the queerest ironies of history, as John Kenneth Galbraith points out in The Affluent Society, is that in a sense Marx won his case with his sworn enemies, the capitalists. Marx loudly asserted that they were selfish and interested only in profits. In the end, many agreed. They accepted the Marxist materialistic view of history. The modern businessman, says Galbraith, suspects that the moral crusade of reformers, do-gooders, liberal politicians, and public servants, all their noble protestations notwithstanding, are based ultimately on self-interest. What, he inquires, is their gimmick? Well, if not only the Marxists, but Western economists and even businessmen themselves end up assuming that their main motive is self-interest and a quest for profit, it is small wonder that they've had a hard time holding their heads high in recent years. But now the research Dr. McClellan has done has come to the businessman's rescue by showing that everyone has been wrong, that it is not profit per se that makes the businessman tick. Instead, it's a strong desire for achievement, for doing a good job. Profit is simply one measure among several of how well a job's been done, but it's not necessarily the goal itself. The same kind of person who matriculates to leadership in business may be found leading in other fields, too. He's the kind of person who spends his time thinking about doing things better. He has a basic concern for achievement. The secret lies in what a person spends his time thinking and daydreaming about when he is not under pressure to think about anything in particular. What do his thoughts turn to when he's not under pressure? It is not the drive for more and more profits that drives the businessman and is responsible for the rise of civilization. It's the achievement goal, the desire for achievement. Let me draw you a little picture. A housewife sits at her kitchen table. The kids are in school. The husband's at work. Outside it's raining. She sips her tepid coffee and turns the pages of a magazine. In the magazine is a picture of a striking woman sitting by the pool of her palatial home. The sun is shining. There are flowers and carefully trimmed hedges, and a child is swimming in the pool. Suddenly the housewife stares at her rain-spattered kitchen window and thinks, if I had what she's got, I'd be happy. Happiness. The state of being happy is one of the world's most interesting subjects. It's so interesting because the state of happiness has nothing whatever to do with environment. A world-famous entertainer steps out of his private jet at the Los Angeles airport and is, at that moment, less happy than the man who will now refuel the airplane. Another time, the entertainer will be happier. But the rich woman in the magazine sitting by her pool in the lovely setting is not by any means happier than the woman in the kitchen with the rain coming down outside. Happiness is never a respecter of persons, high or low, queen or charwoman, rich or poor, white, black, or anywhere in between. A friend of mine who's worth several $1 million and who was one of the happiest people I ever knew has changed completely and is now one of the world's unhappiest people. Not because he's a millionaire, but because all the fun's gone out of his life. Happiness is a byproduct of direction. That is, happiness is a condition that depends upon the direction in which we're moving. My friend had been a happy man most of the time for many years because he had been actively working toward a goal he wanted very much to achieve. Well, he's achieved his goal now, with nowhere else to go, which is his own fault, and he's miserable. The world-famous entertainer leaving his private jet is bored and unhappy. He's heading home to a lonely house. The young man servicing the jet plane has a date that night with a girl he's in love with. He's in a state of euphoria. The woman sitting by the pool with a beautiful home may well be quite happy at the time the picture's taken. She's delighted that she and her friends will soon see her and her home in a national publication. While our housewife, her family scattered to work and school, faces the prospect of a lonely day of laundry, cleaning, and cooking, and besides, it's raining outside. If her husband calls and tells her they're going out to dinner with friends that night, she'll be transformed. Or if she learns that good friends or her family are coming to visit that evening or weekend, the work will fly by as she thinks about and plans for the visit. We're happy when we're moving towards something we want to happen, and that's all there is to it. Nothing else makes much difference. The person or family that's working toward goals, priorities that are not too distant to be exciting, will tend to be happier than the person or family without them. Happiness, it's a very interesting thing. Thank you.